Hello and welcome back. We're going to be talking about the Cold War in Asia and McCarthyism in the United States. So the Cold War took place throughout the world. Last time we were talking about Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Eastern Europe being communist, Western Europe being democratic, and that the Cold War is this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. Well, that carries over into Asia, and one of the places it does is in China. The U.S. wanted a leader in China following World War II who was a little bit maybe more democratic leading, and they wanted a guy named Chiang Kai-shek in there, but he didn't treat the people very well. He wasn't very popular. There was this other guy named Mao Zedong, who was rising in popularity, was out working among the people, and he was communist leading. And what ends up happening is that while the U.S. tries to get this non-communist guy, the communist Mao Zedong, who once again was a communist, he ends up taking power. And when Mao takes power, people in the U.S. they're upset, they're worried. They're just outraged. They're like, why? How can this happen? And they're like, how has the U.S. failed? Now communism is spreading. And so people started coming up with these ideas, and they were like, well, the only way this could have happened is if there were communists or quote-unquote Reds working in the government. There have to be communists within the government. And so what we see is this spread of fear. And communism, this fear of communism, really spreads fear throughout the U.S. And so we're going to be going into another one of those Red Scares like we had in the early 1900s. So this fear of communism really spreads throughout the United States. So question, in China, Mao Zedong was a communist or nationalist? This is also, the Cold War is going to pour over into Korea, so we're going to watch a short YouTube video which covers the Korean War and the U.S.'s involvement in it.
The Korean War, June 25, 1950 through July 27, 1953. At the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was freed from Japanese control. North Korea was occupied by the Soviets while the South was occupied by American forces. By 1948, the country was divided in half at the 38th parallel, with the capitalist South ruled by Syngman Rhee and the communist North ruled by Kim Il-sung. The Soviet troops withdrew from Korea in 1948, and U.S. troops withdrew in 1949. However, North and South Korea, as enemies of one another, would not accept the border between them as permanent. The North Koreans attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950, advancing across the 38th parallel. Around 75,000 troops of the North Korean People's Army defeated the Republic of Korea's army with success, capturing the capital city of Seoul, then occupying the whole of South Korea except for Busan. This was a problem, as President Truman in the United States wanted to contain the spread of communism by preventing the domino effect. That is, if Korea fell, so would other countries to the ideology. South Korea appealed for support, and the United States pushed a resolution through the United Nations Security Council. The USSR did not use its veto power, as it was boycotting the council because the new communist China was not accepted. In China's seat was the pro-US Chinese nationalist government of Taiwan. An appeal was made by the Security Council for North Korea to withdraw its troops, but was ignored. As a result, approval was granted for a UN army made up of an international force of 16 nations to send help to South Korea, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The UN troops, composed mainly of Americans, landed in South Korea in early July, but were soon pushed back on the defense by the North Korean forces, forming a perimeter around Busan to defend the line until reinforcements arrived in August. Now that their position was strengthened, MacArthur went on the offensive. On September 15th, the U.S. Marines X-Corps launched an amphibious assault at Incheon. The North Korean troops were pushed back on the retreat over the 38th parallel, and soon Seoul was recaptured along with the whole of South Korea by the end of the month. Now, MacArthur was to go beyond the initial idea of containment. Truman, worried of a Chinese response, nevertheless approved, and UN troops moved into North Korea on October 7, 1950. On October 12th, they captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and then the Yalu River, which was the border with Communist China. China retaliated by helping the North Koreans, sending 250,000 Chinese troops. The UN troops, overwhelmed by this new force, were pushed out of North Korea with heavy losses. By January 1951, Chinese and North Korean troops had captured Seoul. General MacArthur wanted to use the atom bomb on China and was dismissed for insubordination by President Truman, who went back to a policy of containment. In June 1951, more UN troops were sent to Korea, eventually driving the North Korean army to the 38th parallel and stabilizing the front. Now, a stalemate set in. In July, peace talks began, but a compromise could not be found. Meanwhile, fighting continued, and American pilots fought in the air against Soviet pilots using Chinese jet fighters and wearing Chinese uniforms. General Dwight D. Eisenhower took over as president in early 1953 and sought an end to the war. After 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom on the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone was set up, which stands to this day.
So when we're talking about the Korean War, really what ends up happening is at the end of the Korean War, you still have two Koreas. So Korea is still split into North Korea and South Korea, and the border is exactly the same. The border is still at the 38th parallel. So really, nothing changes after the end of the war. This is just the Korean monument in Washington, D.C. that you can go and see. So question, where was the dividing line between North and South Korea after the Korean War? Was it the 38th parallel or the 58th parallel? Where was the dividing line between North and South Korea after the Korean War? Next question, what was the outcome of the Korean War? Still two Koreas or a united Korea? So now let's look, as all of this is going on, and the U.S. is seeing that, for the first time in a really long time, we're seeing some losses. If you think about it, World War I, when the U.S. entered World War I, we had success. Spanish-American War, U.S. success. World War II, U.S. enters success. And now we have the Korean War, where there's not really a huge success for the U.S. China has now fallen, and so people within the United States are really beginning to have this fear that communists are going to take over the U.S. They're afraid that communism is going to take over the U.S. also. And this fear is going to push people to do things that they normally wouldn't do or accept things they normally wouldn't accept. President Truman will come into office, and he will make what's called the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. And what it will do is it will allow the federal government to investigate government employees and make them basically prove that they're loyal. People who spoke out against the government or maybe had views that were not in line with the government could be fired. Also created is the House Un-American Activities Committee. And this group's job was basically to go out and find people they believed were communists or people who were spreading ideas that were not in line with the democratic ideas of the United States. And so people who were thought to have this communist background were investigated. And even if they had no evidence and it was proved that you hadn't, once you were even interrogated, you could be what was called blacklisted. And basically what that meant is if you were blacklisted, you wouldn't be able to find a job. It would be hard to find work. Your neighbors would always suspect you. And one of the big areas that this happens is in Hollywood. The government will really go in and investigate Hollywood. So when you look at movies from the 1950s, you'll see a fairly similar theme in them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about movies and TV in the 1950s. But blacklisting means, once again, that you basically are going to have a very hard time finding a job, and it's probably because you've been investigated, or at some time someone thought you might have some kind of a communist background. The next kind of step of this fear in the United States that we're talking about, remember this is this fear of communism taking over, is what we call McCarthyism. This is Senator Joseph McCarthy, and basically he made this statement that said that communists were taking over the government. And McCarthy was trying to run for president, and so it got a lot of, and people were like, oh my goodness, communists are in there, they're taking over, and it starts this huge, basically, hunt to try and find people who are communists. He made all of these accusations. He didn't have any evidence whatsoever. There's this huge investigation that goes in, and when it all is said and done, they found out that there was nothing. There was no evidence to support this. He had nothing to prove. He was just making all of these demands. And so that's what we call McCarthyism. So let's watch a little video on McCarthyism.
Senator from Wisconsin, nobody knew till he begins to play about the fears of the nation. The Cold War's in full effect, everyone's scared that Soviets and communists are hiding in our midst. He'll say your name's on the list, even though it don't exist. If you're the least suspicious, McCarthyism has got you now. He's gonna scream that you're a communist, a communist. You're gonna land on a blacklist, on a blacklist. Joseph McCarthy craves power at the cost of your liberty. You'll be accused of un-American activity, so you better give him a name. Give him someone else he can blame, or you'll never work in a game. Make a false claim or accept the blame. This is a second red scare, seeing communists everywhere. So you better go on and swear that you ain't Red Square, or say your prayers. McCarthy is a demagogue in reality. He's a drunken fraud, but even Ike is wary to take him on. He'll say your name's on his list, even though it don't exist. If you're the least suspicious, McCarthyism has got you now. He's gonna scream that you're a communist, a communist. You're gonna land on a blacklist, on a blacklist. Joseph McCarthy craves power at the cost of your liberty. You'll be accused of un-American activity. But then he attacked the army. The public watched on TV, so he had no decency, no decency, no decency. McCarthyism would go on long after old Joe was gone, 'cause the U.S. games interfered. Instead of ideas, it was bounded down, was bounded down, was bounded down. Welcome.
So that's just kind of an overview of McCarthyism, and it really spreads that fear of communists taking over in the U.S. And we're going to see throughout the 50s people losing a lot of their civil rights because of this fear. So, question, McCarthyism is A, making accusations without evidence, or making accusations with evidence. So the next term that we get to, and this is a really important term also, vocab word, is brinkmanship. When Eisenhower's in office, he basically says he wants to stop communism at all costs. Like, he is willing to go to the edge of all-out war to stop communism. And this idea of basically you push things and you go to the very edge of all-out war to stop communism is brinkmanship. So when we talk about brinkmanship, we're going to be seeing throughout this time more and more nuclear bombs being tested, nuclear bombs getting stronger. We're going to see the invention of the hydrogen bomb, and we're really going to see where the United States is building up its military and pushing all of these diplomatic or, pushing relations to the point where we could almost get into an all-out war once again in order to stop communism. Brinkmanship. So I was talking about this. One of the advances is trying to get a hydrogen bomb. They believed a hydrogen bomb, if created, would be even more destructive than an atomic bomb. And the U.S. begins working on this. The Soviets do also, and it becomes a race for who can create the hydrogen bomb the first. If you'll remember, the United States created the first atomic bomb. Now they're in a race. Like I said, the Cold War is really this constant competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so they're always just seeing who can do what first. The U.S. will create and detonate the first hydrogen bomb. This will happen on November 1st of 1952. This gives you a little bit of a picture of what it looks like. What happens is absolute destruction. This is on Bikini Atoll. Just decimates, like it vaporizes islands. This leads to even more fear, because now we don't just have the atomic bomb, we have hydrogen bombs. The Soviets are working on these also. And so this fear now turns to a fear of nuclear weapons. This idea now of a World War III is catastrophic. If World War III were to happen, what would happen to the world? Would the world even be able to handle it? Would the world break apart? Would the earth just fall in on itself? No one knew. But for the next 30 years, the fear of nuclear weapons, the fear of World War III is a fact of life. Air raid drills are common. Bomb shelters are made throughout the United States. There's people who build bomb shelters in their backyards. You'll see these bomb shelters built out throughout. The United States builds them for its government. When you were in school, you would have these air drills. So like today, you guys might do earthquake drills. You might have tornado drills. When we were growing up, we also had air raid drills, we thought that a nuclear bomb was going to be dropped, and what would you do? So this fear, the Cold War, this fear just keeps building and building, and so you have this time that all of this stuff is happening, and it's just building on this fear and competition. So here is our question. What is brinkmanship? Going to the brink of all-out war, or going to the brink of losing territory to avoid a war? What is brinkmanship? Next question. What was the main goal of the United States following World War II? And we're talking about foreign policy, or how we're going to act with other nations. What is our goal? Is it A, containment, or B, allowing all types of governments? Everyone should get to be whatever they want. Continuing with this Cold War, because we talked about NATO being created as a Western European kind of defense alliance, West Germany is going to end up joining NATO. They're going to begin rearming. West Germany will be a base for the United States. And so the Soviets are going to form what's called the Warsaw Pact, and it will be a military alliance for Eastern European nations. So you have NATO, Western European nations, and the Warsaw Pact, which is going to be the Eastern European nations. And this map just kind of shows you NATO versus Warsaw. So continuing with this competition, the other big thing that starts to come out is there's going to be a race to see who can be the very first into space. And it's once again this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it's called the space race. Who can get there first? Well, the Soviets are going to actually get to space first. They will launch the very first successful satellite. That happens on October 4th of 1957. It was named Sputnik. So in this case, the Soviets win. They win this race. And what this is going to do in the United States is once again get that fear going, and it's going to push for changes. Especially there's going to be a huge push with education, with getting math and science included. And it really, really pushes the U.S. to beat the Soviets, especially when it comes to getting a man in space. Getting a human being in space. Like the U.S. wants to make sure that they are next. Another incident that happens that really kind of pushes the Cold War to continue is what's called the U-2 incident. U-2 was a plane. One of our planes that was spying was shot down in the Soviet Union. Before this, the United States has said, no, we're not spying. Then our plane got shot down, and the Soviets were like, hey, just say you did it, give us an apology, and we'll be over it. And the United States refused to apologize, even though they knew they were wrong, and the Soviets had the evidence. And so what happens is, instead of the Cold War, maybe this could have been one of those points where the Cold War ended and we started to work on relations, making things better between the Soviet Union and America. Instead, things get worse. Question: which country launched the first successful satellite into space? The United States or the Soviet Union? And that will be the end of our discussion for today. Next time we'll be talking about a little bit more about what it was like for the culture in the United States following World War II.